Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Risk Assessment of the Learning Environment. We will try to be mindful of your time today and stick to the 1 hour that we've allotted for this webinar. With that being said, we won't have time for live Q&A. Please feel free to email me at kbarksdale@sheriffs.org or use the chat box for questions and leave your email address, and I'll be sure our presenter gets your questions. My contact information and the presenter's email address will be at the end of this presentation. Before I introduce you to our speaker today, I'll give you a quick overview of NSA. Chartered in 1940, NSA is a professional association dedicated to serving the office of sheriff and its affiliates through education, training, and general law enforcement resources. NSA provides these resources and advocacy for sheriffs, law enforcement, criminal justice professionals, and their communities. There are currently over 3,000 sheriffs nationwide. Our membership base includes over 13,000 individual members, including sheriffs, deputies, other law enforcement officers, public safety professionals, and concerned citizens. Today's webinar is supported by the COPS Office. Thank you to the COPS Office for your support. Now to our presenter. Noted author and keynote speaker Steve Tarani has served in the protection services industry for over 30 years as either an employee of or a contractor for both the U.S. defense and civilian law enforcement communities. Specializing in protective intelligence, Steve is a subject matter expert in awareness-based training and is currently the managing member of Certified Safe Schools, LLC, empowering faculty and staff throughout the learning community. Steve has also recently joined NSA's School Safety and Security Committee. With that, I'll pass it over to Steve.
Thank you, Christy. Guys, welcome to the presentation, Risk Assessment of the Learning Environment. In addition to a systematic examination of the learning environment, a quality school safety risk assessment should identify significant threat areas, the likelihood and severity of an unwanted event, and implementation of recommended control measures to reduce environmental risk. In this presentation, you will be introduced to the 3 school safety risk assessment thresholds found in any professional learning environment, the probability of impact of an undesired event at each threshold, and implementation of recommended best practices as risk control measures. Let's first define 4 risk assessment terms used in this presentation. Risk is the measurement of the frequency, probability, and impact of loss from exposure to threats. A threat is a serious, impending, or recurring event that can result in loss, which must be dealt with. In terms of the learning environment, a threat can range anywhere from mean texting to an active shooter. A threat can also refer to an individual or the observable concerning behavior of that individual. Vulnerability. Vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Risk is the product of threat and vulnerability. The greater the threat and/or vulnerability, the greater the risk. Risk assessment is a rational and orderly approach to problem identification and probability determination. Risk assessment is not a reactive approach, but a proactive approach that should be part of any school safety planning process. It involves figuring out the possible risks and how and when to control that risk if it occurs. When appropriately implemented, risk assessment promotes activity for reducing or eliminating long-term risk. The goal of effective risk assessment is sustained threat intervention. Let's take a look at these risk assessment thresholds. The first step in any appropriately implemented risk assessment is to identify significant threat areas or risk assessment thresholds. All K-12 schools, colleges, and universities are subject to the threat of school violence resulting in injury or death. A threat can be introduced to a school in only one of 2 ways: externally or internally. External threats emerge from outside the school. Internal threats evolve from inside the school. It's important to note that external threats emerge and internal threats evolve. Either one can develop from a potential threat into an active threat. These three, external emerging threat, internal evolving threat, and active threat, comprise the 3 points of a school safety triangle. Viewed as a matrix, the school safety triangle offers 3 levels of assessment from the bottom up: behavioral assessment, threat assessment, and incident control. Considered the very tip of the iceberg, incident control sits at the highest level of assessment of the school safety triangle. And if I may share with you a quote from Don Brown, an incident is just the tip of the iceberg, a sign of a much larger problem below the surface. Employed as reactive response to any active physical threat, incident control measures are in place to protect students, faculty, and staff from physical harm, and as such include physical security architecture and devices such as locks, alarms, and personnel such as SROs and or other school security officers. Some schools have more of these and some have less. Referencing the perimeter, areas along the campus perimeter can also be controlled by incident control measures such as fences, locking gates, bollards, vehicle or foot patrol, and the like. Again, some schools have more of these and some have less. The difference between controlled and uncontrolled areas of campus determines whether you have an open or closed campus. If less than 50% of your campus is controlled by physical security, then you are considered an open campus. If 50% or more of your campus is controlled by physical security, then you are considered a closed campus. If placed on a graph, you find yourself in one of 2 positions. You will either be in the green with a closed campus or in the yellow with an open campus. If you're in the yellow, especially in the thicker part of the triangle, there's not much to lean on in terms of physical security, which lends to the critical importance of the lower assessment levels. In addition to physical security, added risk control measures at this threshold should include critical incident management and operational readiness planning. An active threat exhibits attack behavior at the incident control assessment threshold. It is at this upper level threshold where an active threat presents extreme physical violence. At this threshold, the only appropriate response is use of force to stop the physically active threat. The good news is that frequency of an occurrence is lower than that at any other level. Commonly referred to as a low probability, high impact event, recorded incidents of physical attack behavior at schools in the last 20 years demonstrate the very real possibility of students, faculty, and staff being affected by extreme physical violence. Although the lowest probability of occurrence, the high impact of such an occurrence may result in injury or death, a consequence paid for failure at the lower assessment thresholds. There are additional factors that can influence impact at the incident assessment level. One of these is budget. Fiscally speaking and traditionally speaking, security, training, and operations is generally the first budgets to get cut. You then have physical architecture, insurance, or school policy, critical incident, emergency action, and operational readiness planning to include interoperability, communications, interagency memorandums of understanding, designated points of contact, and clearly defined roles and responsibilities. These are all response options. A decrease in response options at the highest impact level causes an increase in risk. In consideration of this increased risk, there are 2 options presented to a risk manager. One is to simply accept the responsibility for that increased risk, and the other, to shift the burden of that risk to the lower assessment levels. Located just below the surface of the iceberg, the threat assessment threshold offers a mid-level threat intervention opportunity. Employed in mitigation of an active threat, the threat assessment threshold offers any number of risk control measures to include the likes of the Salem-Kaiser Student Threat Assessment System, commonly implemented in the Pacific Northwest, and the Cornell Sheriff's Guidelines for Responding to Student Threats of Violence, commonly implemented in the Midwest and the East Coast. These and other similar mid-level risk control measures are not designated to predict violence, but to identify potentially violent situations and resolve them prior to them developing into a violent physical threat, requiring incident control. An active threat exhibits pre-attack behavior at the threat assessment threshold, and you have in place such countermeasures as safe to tell and see something, say something. Frequency at this mid-level intervention opportunity is greater than that at the incident control level. Here is where you may see something, say something, such as a student bringing a weapon on campus, overhearing a plan to victimize someone, or spray paint an external wall. There is less likelihood that you may observe this type of activity than those observable at lower assessment thresholds. Although a low probability of occurrence, it can have a significant impact on students, faculty, and staff should an active threat go unnoticed or fail to be addressed. There are additional factors that can influence impact at the threat assessment level. Assessment methodology, long and short form reporting mechanisms, follow through on actionable items, interoperability to include external community services, communications, prioritization, designated points of contact, and clearly defined roles and responsibility. Located at the base of the iceberg, the behavioral assessment threshold offers the earliest possible threat intervention available in school safety. An undesired event doesn't just appear out of the blue. A gradual evolution of concerning behaviors can be precursors to violence. The most effective way to prevent a potential threat from developing into an active threat is to identify and address actionable items at this lowest possible intervention threshold. Emerging potential threat influencers, observable concerning behavior, and potential violence indicators occur prior to the threat assessment threshold and are considered actionable items at the behavioral assessment threshold. Utilizing recommended best practices, such as employing a behavioral assessment team and setting reporting mechanisms in place, can significantly increase effectiveness at the behavioral assessment level. A potential or developing threat exhibits observable concerning behavior at the behavioral assessment threshold. You can assess anything and everything at this level, from harassment to bullying to sexting to dysregulated behavior to fill in the blank. The frequency of an event occurring at this lowest level of intervention opportunity is higher than those at any other threshold, and therefore presents an extremely high likelihood of observing this type of activity. Although it may have the highest probability of occurrence, such activities result in a relatively low impact on students, faculty, and staff when appropriately identified and addressed. There are, as with the other two levels, there are additional factors that can influence impact at the behavioral assessment level. Campus culture, behavioral assessment team membership, exactly who is on the team, identification and definition of actionable items, and their prioritization, Those of a rural school may be different than those of an urban school. Internal and external interoperability to include communications, designated points of contact, and clearly defined roles and responsibility. There is a corresponding threat status for each assessment level. Applied to either an external threat or an internal threat, the lowest threat status describes a potential threat. Potential threat may be an example of an external student who was dismissed or transferred from another school, say, with known disciplinary issues. Should a potential threat fail to be appropriately identified and addressed at the lowest level, it then would progress to the next status, which is described as a developing threat. A developing threat may be an example of an internal student who has exhibited observable concerning behavior. Both a potential and developing threat may be identified and addressed at the behavioral assessment threshold. Should a developing threat fail to be appropriately identified and addressed at the behavioral assessment threshold, it then would progress to the next status, which is described as an active threat. An active threat may be an example of the same internal student who has exhibited observable concerning behavior, now boasting or planning to bring a gun onto campus. Here, at the threat assessment level, faculty may discover his nefarious plan and intervene. However, failure at the threat assessment threshold allows the active threat to carry out his plan. Such an undesired event, which would then require reliance upon incident control, the indicators and behaviors presented at each assessment threshold determine the corresponding threat status. Addressing those items at the lower threshold affords threat control at the earliest intervention opportunity. The relationship between a threat status and its assessment level delineate opportunities for threat intervention. The earliest threat intervention opportunity is at the behavioral assessment threshold, which is where potential threat influencers and developing threat behaviors are presented. Failing intervention at this lower level, a potential threat can develop into an active threat. The threat assessment threshold is where pre-attack behaviors are presented, such as planning and preparation for physical violence. Failing intervention at the mid-level opportunity, an active threat can progress to physical violence. The incident control assessment threshold is where attack behaviors are presented, warranting physical security countermeasures. Appropriate risk assessment at each of the corresponding assessment thresholds allow faculty and staff to employ effective risk control measures, such as identifying and addressing a threat at the earliest possible intervention opportunity. Risk assessment at the lowest intervention threshold is a proactive measure, resulting in threat prevention. Managing risk at the mid-level intervention threshold is an active measure, resulting in threat mitigation. Managing risk at the highest level intervention threshold is a reactive measure, resulting in threat response. Some risk, once identified, can be readily eliminated or reduced. However, some risks are much more difficult to mitigate, particularly high-impact, low-probability risks. Therefore, risk assessment needs to be an ongoing, long-term, collaborative effort and is the responsibility of school leadership, faculty, and staff. In addressing school violence, risk assessment can identify antecedents to undesired consequences. Such behaviors are inherently problematic and often escalate into more serious incidents. In most cases, prior to a physical attack, an evolving threat presents behaviors that signal impending violence. Many of these tragedies could have been prevented, which substantiates the importance of identifying students of concern, assessing the risk for engaging in violence or other harmful activities, and implementing intervention. The threshold for intervention should be low so that faculty and staff can identify students in distress before their behavior escalates to the level of eliciting concerns about safety. Supervision and classroom management, combined with awareness of escalation, are often beneficial in situations like these. If the student's behavior is below the threat assessment threshold, school counseling, mental health professionals, calming rooms, and other resources can be utilized to identify triggers, allow de-escalation, and prevent victimization of others. In summary, we've covered the 3 school safety risk assessment thresholds found in any professional learning environment: the frequency, probability, and impact of an undesired event at each threshold, and implementation of control measures or recommended best practices to reduce the associated risks. Risk assessment is the process of identifying, analyzing, and then corresponding to any risk throughout the cycle of potential, developing, or active threat. The purpose of applying effective risk assessment to the learning environment is to achieve sustainable threat intervention at the lower assessment levels. Guys, as Christy had mentioned, the question and answers are available through an email. If you may have any or would like any further information or background on this presentation, please feel free to contact me at steve.tarani@certifiedsafeschools.com. Christy?
Thank you, Steve. A huge thank you to you for your time today on such a great webinar. Thank you again to the COPS office for your support on today's webinar. Please feel free to email me at kbarksdale@sheriffs.org if you have any questions. Thank you all for your time today. Have a great day.